Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream event on the 8th of November 2022. Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics here. Great to have you on, and welcome to the Tuesday live show. As always, just before I bring my guest in, I want to remind you that we're not giving specific financial or legal advice or property advice on the channel. It's a general conversation only. We do moderate the chat, so feel free to add comments in there, but please no racial slurs, and just respect everybody else in the conversation, please. As at the 8th of November, if you're watching in replay, if you'd like to ask a question or get my attention, please use @WalkTheWorld. That then puts the question into a different queue and I'll make sure I see it. And I've also enabled Super Chat, which enables you to get your question top of the list or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Anyhow, without further ado, I'm going to bring Robbie and John in. Now, just to explain, I push this button. John, hello.
Hi, mate. How you going?
Yeah, good. So, John Adams, you're going to be on audio only because your setup there doesn't allow video, but great to have you on. And Robbie, you should be there.
I am, Martin. How are you?
Yeah, very good. Welcome to you both, and thanks very much for coming on tonight. Very interesting conversation, and we're going to talk a little bit about what I call the financial system, right? And it's just worth thinking about, Robbie, what we mean by the financial system, because it's a big spider's web, right? It's a spider's web that's into everything. It's a massive amount.
And there's lots of big numbers.
I was going to say massive numbers at left, right and centre. But just a few that off the top of my head, 30 billion per annum into the superannuation system paid by people who own superannuation. The balance of the superannuation is 3.3 billion, right? The total mortgage book in Australia is 2 trillion. 3.3 trillion, I should say, not billion. Yeah, so it's big. But if you then think about the total debt around the world, we've had more debt than ever. And that debt, of course, sits across both central banks and it sits across corporates and it sits across households. And then we've got the old derivatives, and how you calculate that. Well, you can make it quadrillions of exposure depending on how you calculate it, right? But the point is that this whole edifice is essentially at the heart of pretty much everything that goes on. And I guess my input thesis is it's actually become an end in itself rather than a means to an end. And I guess that's really an interesting point of departure for a discussion.
Well, I think it's probably the fundamental issue. It's a legacy of decades of economic policy that unleashed the financial wizards who were able to use their advantage because they were in banks, etc., to tie up the financial system to their own advantage and then make it exist for itself rather than for what the financial system is for, which is to serve the real economy. You can make money from money, as they say, rather than make money from production and make money from investment, the extending credit into productive things that then you earn a return on. The other way was much better. And then they got smarter, and they're clever people, these finance wizards. And you always have those kind of clever tricksters in the world, Martin. It's just that until 3 or 4 decades ago, we had governments that knew that it was their job to keep them in line. And then they decided it wasn't. And now they've been running the world ever since. And then as it's collapsed under its own weight, bring in the central bankers to rig the rules to find more and more ways to prop them up. And I think that's the nub of the problem that we're dealing with. The only little provocative caveat I'll add, and it would be provocative to some people, is unlike, say, 2008 in that global financial crisis, when I know I personally thought literally the whole world was in the same poo here, there's a distinctive shift away from this type of economics in the majority of the world. What we're dealing with, instead of it's the old Dutch disease, I think it's what's left of the white man's disease, frankly. The Europeans, the North Americans, Australians and Kiwis, we're hanging on to this. We're hanging on to the coattails of London and Wall Street. A lot of the rest of the world are moving in another direction because they want to live They want to survive.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important international contextual point, right? Because effectively we sometimes take a very myopic view that this is the only way that an economy can work, et cetera, et cetera. One other interesting observation, and I want to put this one up because I think George makes a really interesting point here. He makes the point, well, derivatives are largely offsetting, so it's not really quadrillion. Well, yeah, in a steady state, right? The difficulty
on paper.
The difficulty is, of course, that if you actually have a movement in the markets, then those offsets aren't actually netted off. And that's the problem, right? So actually nobody quite knows what the real risk profile is of the derivatives. And okay, 50 to 60% are now put through exchanges, which is better than it was 10 years ago, but that's still a lot not going through exchanges. So a lot of people don't know exactly what the complete exposure profile is. And of course, people are betting and taking positions. So it's not as if the derivatives are supporting, an underlying asset. It's actually lots of different speculative positions. So effectively, as the markets move, you can be out of position. I think that's something which a lot of people still haven't necessarily got their head around.
Well, the devil's in the detail with these individual contracts, and there's assumptions in all of them. And by any measure, the people who raked over the coals of 2008 were able to identify after the fact the kinds of assumptions that had gone into those derivatives that literally blew up the world. And what they saw are the real world, events that these derivatives, when they were crafted, never took account of. And the problem with that is that since the early 90s, we've had a series of catastrophes with derivatives. When are we going to say what George is saying is the theory on paper? And if it was true, we wouldn't have had any of these problems. What happens is you'll get an unanticipated shock, and that unanticipated shock makes the terms of the derivatives contract turn very bad, right? And suddenly there's a massive liability that they can't hope to ever be able to pay, and a whole series of cascading bankruptcies on the back of that. And that's been the story. I mean, we tracked all this through the 90s. Remember a couple of years ago, you and I did a show on Australian bank derivatives and all those graphs. We were tracking these things, these stories during the 90s. Orange County, you can read the books on them. Orange County, California, Barings Bank. And then the big one was long-term capital management in 1997. They thought that was the end of the world until 2008. And now we're in 2022, what are we in? We're in a year and a severe financial crisis defined by the ultimate event that was seemingly outside of everyone's calculation, right? The knock-on effect from what's happening in Ukraine with Russia. And that's affected Australian and world interest rates and all sorts of things. So, and there's lots of trouble brewing under the surface that could erupt any moment.
Yeah, and it's worth just reflecting on what happened in the UK just over a month ago, right? When, in fact, the then Prime Minister announced a change in strategy, which essentially put interest rates onto a different trajectory, and the £1 trillion of long-term bonds that were actually being used by pension funds, superannuation funds in the UK, against which they were taking positions to be able to actually trade to get better returns, suddenly went all off. So the value of the bonds dropped by 40 or 50%, and they then discovered that they needed margin calls because they had these exposures, and the whole system nearly fell over, and the Bank of England had to intervene. That's a great example of a shock not expected and how it has huge consequences. And even today, some of the bond rates in the UK and mortgage rates in the UK are different from what they would have been without that shock. So it shows you that if you've got this huge dependency on the financial system and something hits it from the external position, you end up with some very significant outfall and quite often in an unpredictable and unsatisfactory way.
Yeah, and London is a good example because it's the biggest financial centre in the world. It's the biggest derivatives trading centre in the world, and they've made a lot of hay out of this particular trade. It's also an example of an economy that isn't what it used to be. right? And so all these pension funds that are there to pay the pensions of these retired people, they're invested in a casino. And the the relationship between the fund and the investment banks that sold and the derivatives that were essentially the insurance they could guarantee their returns. That's what blew up. There were massive margin calls from that, and it's just an example of the system. So through the intermediary of the financial system in London, the retired British people had to be exposed to a system that was doing all sorts of tricks to leverage returns so they could pay their retirements, because the actual true state of the underlying British economy is not enough to fund the retirements of the English people themselves because of how badly it's been damaged. And there's all this hand wringing over the way the industrial north of England is now a rust belt, right? Because it was all self-inflicted. But when and we're seemingly so much more sophisticated their economies now. No, mate. If you don't have a basic productive system where people where your local economy is capable of producing real wealth, you can look really good on paper, and it's all a Potemkin village.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let me bring John in. John, I want to talk to you briefly about the other issue with regard to debt, and that's the debt that we have in Australia relative to the rest of the world. Right, we have a very significant debt exposure. And I know that you on several occasions have been saying that this is probably one of the most critical issues that people don't fully understand.
Sure. And look, so we've obviously spoken about foreign debt on the interest of the people, and I've obviously done it in terms of other forums as well. So we owe the world in gross terms about $2.5 trillion, in net terms about $1.2 trillion. I think around vis-a-vis GDP around just north of 50%, and a lot of Australians believe we're entitled to the lifestyle we've lived for the last 20, 30 years, and people don't realise that it's been wrapped up on an international credit card. That obviously the more foreign debt we build up, that just makes us more indebted to the rest of the world, and obviously it means we lose sovereignty. I mean, there's a lot of people, a lot of listeners on this tonight's call who are interested in personal sovereignty, national sovereignty. It's something that Robbie and I have spoken offline multiple times, and I mean, given our foreign debt position, we've effectively lost control of foreign policy. So our foreign policy is limited to the extent that we can't make decisions in the national interest if the foreign debt becomes a factor in geopolitical calculations. So we owe a lot of money to the Americans, and I think even in some of our previous shows, Martin, in 2019, when we had Dr. Peter Brain, and he basically said that even if we wanted to default on the foreign debt, the Americans wouldn't allow it, and that would obviously have ramifications. And when you look at our reliance on US military technology and foreign capital and a whole bunch of other sort of key inputs that make Australia, that makes us highly interdependent. And we saw what happens when the supply chains become disrupted vis-a-vis the pandemic, and some of the basic necessities that we required here in Australia, we weren't able to supply ourselves, and we were in short supply, and that caused a whole host of issues in local markets. So the foreign debt is obviously a very big issue, but now we can turn it around. It would require dramatic policy changes in terms of tax, driving up savings. It would, interest rate policy, obviously, and prudential policy. But so it can turn around. I mean, Singapore, when Lee Kuan Yew took over in I think 1965, had a huge foreign debt problem as well. Highly dependent on international capital, current account deficits, and took him about 15, 20 years to turn the external position of Singapore around, and he was able to do that. Very dramatic policies, both in terms of economic and political and social policy. But Singapore is a very interesting example of how a stable but strong government was able to take a third generation country to a third world country to a first world country within a single generation. Never done before, and Lee Kuan Yew pulled it off. And one could hope we could have that type of leadership in Canberra someday, but unfortunately with Mr. Albanese, I don't think we have it.
Don't hold your breath. And one other quick observation, John. Of course, the cost of the debt's gone up, right? Because the international interest rate market is a lot higher than it was. So that means that if you look at the debt today, the cost of that debt to the Australian economy is significantly higher than it was, and it will go on rising.
Yes. So obviously, as global interest rates go up, that obviously has an issue with our debt servicing costs, both domestically and internationally, but also the value of the exchange rate. And obviously, when the value of the dollar goes down, which it has done over the last 6 months, it creates a higher cost of importing capital into the country. And that because obviously, and that then that causes other issues as well. So obviously there's a whole host of people out there that have racked up huge volumes of debt over the last few years, particularly during the pandemic, and now we've gone from 0.1 to 2.85. And I'm a little bit surprised, Martin, that the impact hasn't hit households faster, but I think we're getting close to the crunch point that a lot of households are starting to really have some significant cash flow issues that are going to force people to make some tough decisions about real estate, etc. And obviously, as we go into December, the RBA will be raising interest rates again, so that will be another blow to households. But I will just make one controversial point about what Robbie had to say, because Robbie was trying to give the implication that Western countries have a debt problem, and somehow Western countries have deviated away from the rest of the world. So he is right in the sense that there is a divergence in the world now between the BRICS countries and the Western countries in terms of who will control in terms of the financial system, the banking system, and then obviously trade, investment flows, etc. But there is no innocent party in this global debt bubble. So the Chinese have one of the biggest debt bubbles in the world, and anytime Robbie talks about China, his justification is, well, they racked up huge volumes of debt, but they did something productive with that money. Whereas in the West, we wasted it on military foreign occupations that benefit no one. And so while he does have a point on that, let us not be naive that the Chinese have a huge debt problem. And obviously with Evergrande, that was a huge systemic issue that could have, in theory, brought down the CCP. The funny thing is about geopolitics in Beijing, that the biggest issue for the Chinese government is not Western powers. It is this debt bubble. Because dare I say, I think if the debt bubble was to pop in China, and you had a huge depression, the Chinese people would basically rally against their own government because of harsh economic conditions. And we've just seen in the last couple of years examples of where certain banks in China get into problems, and then you see local bank runs and people becoming very aggressive against government officials, etc. So, the emerging countries, China, the BRICS countries, they're all drowning in debt. They're all guilty of the same sins as the West. I don't look at this in ideological terms. I just look at this in terms of pure maths. And the pure maths is that Chinese are in huge trouble with debt. I think Harry Dett's been on your program multiple times over the last few years talking about the Chinese debt bubble as being the largest in the world. And there is some statistical validity in that. And that I think we should, stick to the maths and keep the ideology out when it comes to debt.
Yeah, well, let's come back to Robbie, because Robbie, I got two observations. Firstly, of course, if you actually look at the distribution of Australian debt, a lot of it's in the US. So we do seem to have a very strong alignment between our own economy and the US economy. But then John is also right insofar that the debt burden in China is also pretty strong as well.
But not the foreign debt, not the nation's debt. It's private debt, corporate debt in China, and I'm not saying the China is a country without debt, but my very strong point is there's a lot of difference what they did with that debt, and that makes a difference to whether their debt can be paid or not. The real estate troubles that China had, bear in mind, China hasn't had the runaway inflation that we've all been experiencing, because the troubles that they started having in real estate were not caused by actions like our Reserve Bank and the Fed raising rates to tame inflation. They were caused by deliberate government policy to rein in the real estate bubble. There's a lot of catastrophism about China all the time. It's been going on for 20 years. A crazy American named Gordon Chang wrote a book called The Coming Collapse of China in 2000, and he keeps going on Fox News to spruik his book every 5 minutes. It hasn't happened because people don't appreciate enough the difference between investing in physical economy and investing in speculative assets. Even all the palaver about ghost cities 5 years ago, they don't exist anymore. They're all full. China did long-term planning. Yeah, they built these big empty cities, and now they're all full because there's been this big migration of people from the countries into the cities. But the core, however big and bad the real estate bubble got in China, I remember when we were told there were 50 million empty houses in China, and I think I would have pointed out to you at the time, John, if you did the per capita calculation, the 1 million empty homes in Australia is more than the 50 million empty properties was in China per capita, right? And unlike Australia, where our property bubble has literally been the only game in town outside of resources, it's a property bubble. In China, outside of the property bubble, a massively productive economy that is generating real wealth for itself and for countries that trade with it. And one of those countries is us. We benefit. At the start of the pandemic, our trade surplus with China was 70 billion. It's now 120 billion. That's thanks to the increase in iron ore shipments, but especially the price. This year it's just gone through the roof. And that's us. We're benefiting from that. And we're benefiting because people in China still want to buy iron ore because they're doing things with iron. Our party is now helping to push, along with One Nation, and there's a Labor Senator, Glenn Steele, who helped get it up. There's an inquiry into a project called Project Iron Boomerang to take iron ore from the Pilbara across to Queensland and coal from Queensland back across to the Pilbara, and have steel mills at either end and produce slab steel for a little bit for Australia's use, but mainly for exporting around the world. We'll invite the steel companies in these countries like Japan and Korea and China and India, et cetera, to come and set up their own steel mills so they can actually do the processing here in Australia. That's the sort of thing that any country that's thinking will do to industrialise itself. But we're going to have a huge fight with ideologues who are still committed to the Keating model of just not producing in Australia and will trade with the rest of the world based on the income from our resources, right? So we want to change the way Australia is structured, but before the change, all we've got is resources in the property bubble. China's economy is very, very different to that. Now, we are therefore, it is, I've said this before, in principle, it's not healthy for any economy to be as dependent on China as we are for trade, because it's so much bigger than any other trading partner we've got. It's not funny. But we are lucky it's China that's the country we're dependent on for trade. On the other hand, our financial dependence on the Anglo-American financial system is huge, massive. That's who we're indebted to. And on top of that, they're the biggest foreign investors in Australia. They're our absentee landlords. Between them, there's something like $3 trillion of Australia that they own, the Brits and the Americans, and they're extracting real wealth from us every year as interest and returns on those investments that they have in Australia. And that is economically and politically the big problem, not our connection to China.
Yeah, and that's an important observation, isn't it? Because if you look at the capital flows, and then if you look at the Federal Reserve and the way that the Federal Reserve sets the financial global agenda, right? Why are interest rates going up around the world? It's because the Federal Reserve essentially has said we will need to lift interest rates to tackle inflation in the US. As a result of that, the dollar's gone extremely high. That's putting huge pressure on many other developed countries. And it's basically now created a completely different environment, and interest rates are rising even in Australia, slightly more slowly because the RBA is left behind. But essentially what the Fed does, and the way the Fed actually determines to drive its policy, is enough to really, well, it actually influence pretty much everything going around the rest of the world, economically speaking, isn't it? And I wonder whether they are actually interested in other than their own interests. Well, probably not, because they're obviously looking at it from the point of view of what's best for America. But the fallout is what I'm concerned about. And, you know, as I mentioned to John a little while ago, the debts that we've got, and a lot of that debt is into the US where the rates are now higher, that's going to actually put a significant burden on. And, of course, in Australia, a lot of the banks are leveraged up, including a lot of debt from overseas, to make mortgages. So we've now got the situation where the banks themselves have a large amount of debt, and we've got a lot of debt now in the system down to the community and household level, very high inflation in house prices, and now that's being hit because of what the Fed is doing. So there's a weird problem here that I'm not sure that many people really have understood how it works.
Yeah, well, I agree with John that the debt is a huge vulnerability. I just place a different emphasis on he's right. What the debt means, we've been living beyond our means. The point I make is that it's because we dismantled our means, right? It's not just because we're fat and lazy and like flat screen TVs. We dismantled our means as a country, and that's when the debt soared, because we stopped being a country that produced its own means, right? And that's what we've got to change if we're going to get in control of this debt problem, get our sovereignty back. We have to change that, and that's why we advocate policies like public investment in the means that the infrastructure, etc., the industries that can get our means back. That's how we have to progress as a country, or else we're not going to get anywhere. We're going to be completely beholden to this. And if you want an example of how much the Brits and the Americans, and the Americans are the more dominant ones now, but you know the Americans have a standing in the world that's entirely based on enjoying the world's reserve currency. That allows them to print money like crazy and export their inflation to the rest of the world, right, etc. And it's a system that they're prepared to start World War III over to defend, because the rest of the world is getting jacked off with it, right? They're sick of the way the Americans have used this US dollar system to bash countries up. And the Americans are going to play real hardball to try and defend it. And that's the nub of the issue with the geopolitical crisis with Russia and China at the moment. But they've played hardball with us. You know, in where you guys live there in Wollongong, you had one of the greatest local members in the world in the 1970s, Rex Connor. He wanted to buy back the farm. He had this whole plan to buy back the farm. And that meant he wanted to set up a system where Australians would control Australian resources, not the government. He wanted Australian companies to control Australian resources. That's what buy back the farm meant. And they wanted to build infrastructure, etc. But when he went to Wall Street and when he went to London to borrow money the way we'd always borrowed, those entities wouldn't lend to Australia. There was a capital strike against Australia because it was their mining companies that Rex Connor was going to buy out. That's why they didn't want to give up control of Australia's resources, and they just absolutely refused to lend. And you can hear this speech. You can read the speech Rex Connor gave. He made the point that this decision not to lend to Australia was particularly crazy because the commercial value of the known resources in Australia at the time was something like $5.5 trillion, and all he wanted to borrow was $4 billion against that $5.5 trillion. And they refused to lend it. And that, of course, that led them to more desperate acts like the loan scandal. But that's the way the money That's an example of the way the money is used for control, international geopolitical control. And we've never broken out of that ever since. It's even stronger now, and it's a huge vulnerability. So when we talk about our domestic policies like investing in the real economy and get our productive sector back again, that is very much motivated by the need for Australian sovereignty.
Right. Well, let's just move the conversation slightly forward because, of course, there are other very important players in this whole question of the way the economy works. And we've got the Treasury and the government on one side, and then we've got all the regulators, APRA and ASIC and RBA and all those other people who sort of have irons in the fire. And I guess the question I've got, and I'll get a bit of a comment from both of you, but Robbie, start with you. Has the way that the government's been operating, Treasury and these regulators, actually been positive in terms of dealing with some of these issues, or have they basically just taken the Kool-Aid and just carried on same old, same old? A bit of a Dorothy Dixon.
This is what
perhaps.
they call it, Dorothy Dixon, Martin. Don't throw me into the briar patch. No, it's been an absolute disaster. I mean, Treasury has just been the handmaiden to through the regulators to the banks, right? The banks totally turned the financial system on its head in the way I described before. It's just making money from money now, but that involved a lot of abuse, a lot of misconduct, a lot of fraud, and you've got two regulators that people think are there to somehow protect them, and it turns out they're not. One is there to make sure, think about APRA. APRA's number one responsibility is perverse. It's there to make sure the banks are stable, and that's it. And in APRA's view, stable means massively profitable, and massively profitable means if they're ripping off customers, then it doesn't matter because that's what helps them be massively profitable, right? Therefore, they're stable. Don't bother me with this. And a lot of bank victims went to APRA and found that out. That was APRA's attitude. And ASIC has presided over I think the real problem began in 1998 forward with when ASIC was set up. So it's 24 years of Wild West financial predation that, Australia has become a paradise for white collar criminals. And we've got really weak, ineffective regulator. And the government has just sat by and let it happen. And when this was questioned, this has come up in multiple inquiries, and we're going to get another one, but but there's good reasons for that. But in the past, when this has come up, they've actually been quite frank and said, we have a philosophy we're governed by now, and this is, it can be expressed as caveat emptor, right? Let the buyer beware. But the more technical name that APRA itself explained is we're governed by the efficient markets hypothesis. That's how we believe in the efficient markets hypothesis, and that means essentially, the layman's term, the markets can't be wrong. They're self-correcting, even if there are a few bodies that they have to roll over in order to self-correct. Well, those bodies are hundreds of thousands of Australians, but don't worry about that. The markets are self-correcting. We're not going to do anything proactive here. And the problem is when you actually drill down, it goes against the grain of even the people that I'm happy to argue with, in terms of the extensions of their beliefs. The people who are tried and true believers in the free market, they know that's bullshit because you've got to have some form of law enforcement. You cannot have just Wild West, anything goes, right? It ain't the law of the jungle. There has to be you've got to have rules that are upheld as rules, right? Or else the system ain't going to work. And that's what, we're now getting to the point where there's a growing awareness that this has gone badly wrong, and we get this inquiry to try and look into that.
Well, let's bring John back in. John, we've covered the ASIC inquiry quite recently. We had the senator on the interests of the people the other day, and in fact I've got a picture of that if I can find it. There you go, I'll put that up there. So we did an interview with Senator Bragg just yesterday, and it was quite interesting getting it direct from him as how important he saw this and how critical it was. But I guess the question that we've always got to ask ourselves is, well, we've had lots of inquiries in the past. the Financial Services Inquiry and the Royal Commission, really didn't change much. And it comes back to what I think Robbie was saying a second ago about the ideological assumptions that actually underpin the way things work. So I guess the question, John, what do you think? Do you think there's a chance this time that ASIC's inquiry might actually shift the dial?
Well,
Oh.
I want to answer that question, Martin, but head over. And I really think that I need to just go back and recap a few points, because I think Robbie sounds great on paper, but once you start to dig into the substance of what Robbie has to say, I mean, he and his party have to answer for. So I mean, obviously the first thing is that now debt is debt. A debt bubble is that it basically, we're pregnant, the Chinese are pregnant, but the Chinese have a slightly better baby. So therefore, their issue is less severe than our problem. I mean, I just don't buy that argument at all. They have a huge problem. We have a huge problem. We're not Satan. They're not angels. And so I mean, even though I would agree we wasted a lot of money on foreign occupations, particularly the US, what they did in Iraq. I mean, the thing is that the Chinese economy is built on a house of sand, and even though they have some additional things to speak for compared to the West, a global disintegration of the debt bubble. Now, hang on, Robbie. Global disintegration of the debt bubble can bring huge social and political ramifications. That's point one. Now, point two, Martin, is you talked about the dominance of the US Federal Reserve. So obviously, yes, the US Federal Reserve with the dollar standard is dominating the global financial system. And obviously certain countries resent that level of dominance, given how irresponsible the Americans have been with both fiscal and monetary policy. So the whole movement around the BRICS movement is to break away that dominance. And obviously, as you said, Martin, the US Federal Reserve is raising rates. That's having huge ramifications across the world. And obviously, certain people resent that issue or that level of control, that coercive control, particularly through the SWIFT system, where the Americans are now controlling certain foreign governments through sanctions, vis-a-vis the banking system. People don't want that. Even the Germans have spoken about breaking away from the SWIFT system so that they don't have to be beholden to the dictates of Washington. So obviously this dominance of the US Federal Reserve is becoming a big issue in geopolitics, and that's why the BRICS movement is moving the way it is now. In relation to one of the things Robbie said was about getting control of the economy. Now, coming to the regulators now, because we have such a big debt bubble, the thinking in Canberra as well as in Sydney, Melbourne, among the bureaucratic elite, and obviously in Parliament, and obviously I think in one of our shows, Martin, this year, I talked about certain conversations I had in federal Parliament about the debt bubble. They understand the political ramifications of letting the debt bubble go. So Robbie is right in the sense, and I think, Martin, you are right in the sense that the RBA, APRA, ASIC, for example, AFCA, potentially, they're all designed to perpetuate the debt bubble. So so obviously we have a huge debt bubble that can't be allowed to collapse. And so all of public policy and all of these agencies are designed to keep the system going, and rather than actually having the Harry Dent deflationary depression. So obviously, for example, when the pandemic commenced, the government of the day, the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg, issued a new statement of expectations about ASIC, and it was no longer a focus on litigation. It was a focus on assisting the economy to grow. And obviously, if people read between the lines, that was ASIC go soft on the private sector and the banks, and let the banks issue credit heavily into the private market to drive economic growth up. during 2020 and 2021. And so ASIC's so it's a very interesting. Senator Bragg talked about the core function of ASIC is law enforcement, and yet they were basically told to put their hands behind the back and don't do law enforcement in order to allow the banks and the private sector to engage in entrepreneurship and commerce to be able to assist the economy driving forward. Now, if you want these regulators, the RBA, ASIC, and APRA, to run a proper public policy that drives good public policy outcomes for Australia, one is you've got to clean out the leadership, and that's what I hope we're going to do with this ASIC inquiry, and I'll come back to that point. But the main thing is, what's the cause of all these regulators and departments acting the way they are? It's the debt. It's the debt bubble. The only solution is to shrink the debt. And the reality is, and for the people listening on this podcast, the Citizens Party is against shrinking the debt. Because, and Robbie and I have had multiple conversations about this, and Robbie took huge exception, Martin, to our show that we did back in, I think, 2019 or 2020, that only the 10th Prime Minister can save Australia, because the only way to shrink the debt is to push the economy into a recession, to basically raise interest rates to the point that a lot of these mortgages fail. You're going to have a banking crisis. I've told Angus Taylor, the Shadow Treasurer, that you've got to consciously and purposely push the banks into a point of in terms of the default. You've got to restructure the banks. You've got to take a lot of these toxic, uneconomical mortgages out of the mortgage book, and then you've got to reset the economy. And obviously, I think you interviewed Steve Keen on this channel, Martin, a couple of years ago, when he said that household debt has to shrink by 2/3 for it to be sustainable. Now, so the only way to ensure that public agencies and public officials are going to act responsibly moving forward is we've got to address the key problem in the room. And anytime we've spoken about consciously pushing the economy into recession. Well, I mean, here's the irony: is a lot of people paint the Citizens Party as a far right party. They are actually a centre left party. So they are, quasi old Labor socialists, and they don't support allowing the market to reap because of the consequences with unemployment and homelessness and all those things that happen. So the real, if we're going to get to the core issue of how do we ensure that ASIC and APRA and the RBA behave in a way that is promoting good public policy, we have to solve the problem. And unfortunately, when push comes to shove, if Robbie was our Prime Minister today, and Martin, if we were doing a show, we said Prime Minister Barwick, collapse the economy, push it into a depression, shrink the debt. Prime Minister Barwick just doesn't have the stomach to do it, and neither does the Citizens Party. So while we have this issue of the debt, there is a certain limitation as to how we're able to fix ASIC and also fix APRA and the RBA. But while we have this problem that isn't going anywhere anytime soon, I do think that this time around we do have the ability to drive change at ASIC, and the inquiry will come and will rise and fall on the basis of these case studies. So, Martin, I can tell our audience, this audience tonight, that today I received 2 phone calls of shocking examples of people who have had who have had specific experiences with ASIC in vis-a-vis live investigations, there's a lot of things that have happened that have been kept in the darkness, swept under the rug by ASIC, and this inquiry is really going to bring a lot of these stories out. Let me give you one example. A particular whistleblower who spoke to me today talked about systemic corruption at a financial planning firm in Victoria. An investigation commenced at ASIC in July 2020. Here we are, more than 2 years later, and ASIC has not done anything with the investigation. Supposedly, they've interviewed a few people. The case has gone from one investigator to another, and then gone back to the original investigator, and yet no charges, no resolution to the case. And so, after 2 years neglect and negligence by ASIC. These mum and dad investors who have no idea they're being ripped off left, right, and centre are basically going to be vulnerable. And this whistleblower, I think, is considering making a submission to the inquiry, and I obviously encourage that person to be able to do so. So I think the case studies are going to be shocking. I think the case studies are going to force ASIC to answer a lot of questions that they don't want to answer. I'll be both publicly and privately calling for heads to roll, because I know of certain people at ASIC who've been there for 20 years, and I think they've been there too long. They're not performing, and the agency, obviously, according to my report, has gone in decline. So we do. If we don't achieve leadership change, not just in terms of the commission, and just for our audience, ASIC has a non-executive board of a chairman, 2 deputy chairs, and 2 associate commissioners, which is the non-executive board, the commission. And then you have the next level down, which is the day-to-day executive leadership team called the executive board. That executive board has to be dismantled, and a number of those people who've been there for 10 to 20 years have to go if we're going to have a hope to reform the agency. But the reform also has to be beyond just change of leadership and change of personnel. There has to be a wholesale transformation program of the agency, how it runs, how it trains its staff, how it pays its staff. I think some of their investigators are, in some instances, potentially underpaid, but also data technology, and they obviously have to have the appetite and the mindset that their job is to enforce the law. They have to investigate, and they have to go after the crooks. And I think there's a lot of white-collar crime in this country. There's a lot of white-collar crime in China that maybe Robbie wants to talk about as well. But I honestly think that this time around, particularly, and look, I don't want to blow my trumpet, but I think that, Martin, the focus, we've been able to give this issue on our channel over the last couple of months. And obviously, just like with the catch ban, we've led the way. And obviously, our work has led to the inquiry. A lot of people are now aware of our commentary, the report, and a lot of people are now talking amongst themselves. A lot of people are contacting you, contacting me, and basically everyone's, you can start to feel the energy across the country of people who want to tell their story to Parliament. So I think we're going to see some explosive stories. And tomorrow is going to be a very critical day, Martin. Tomorrow at 12:15. ASIC will be before Senate estimates for 75 minutes. There'll be a number of very interesting questions being posed. And 2 and a half weeks ago, ASIC was before the House of Representatives and said that I was simplistic, i.e., I'm a Wollongong bogan that's not very smart. And here we are within the Senate inquiry. And I think their attitude is going to be completely different tomorrow. And I think they'll be hard pressed because what I've sensed is some people in the House who are relatively new and in the House of Representatives don't fully understand ASIC and its history, whereas people in the Senate are very well versed in how poorly run ASIC is. And I think tomorrow, but also on the 25th of November, when ASIC goes before the Joint Committee on Corporations and Financial Services, ASIC's going to feel that the atmosphere in Parliament has completely changed, and that's because of, in the interest of the people. And I'm not going to give up on this one. I think the financial cops are crook in this country, and we need to clean them up.
Yeah, thanks, John. Well, kudos to you for that report and for all the work you've put into it. And I'll be watching tomorrow. Robbie, you should probably come back and defend the accusation that you wouldn't collapse the economy, you would keep the debt level high if you were PM. Clearly, there is a difference of opinion between you and John on this.
Oh, you think? Well, before I do though, I also want to answer the question of why the ASIC inquiry is different. This time is different, and there's 3 reasons. One is it's the first inquiry after the Royal Commission, and the Royal Commission was a sea change in proving to people that the banks were crooks. Right before the Royal Commission, John Howard called it rank socialism, just the idea of a Royal Commission. Scott Morrison voted against it 26 times. Nothing wrong with the banks; they're fine, right? Oh yeah, there's a few rogue operators, right? That's why there were financial victims and stories by Del Ferguson on Four Corners or whatever. But that was just on the margins. It wasn't systemic. The Royal Commission showed it was systemic, right? Nobody could deny after that there was a huge problem. And look at the not just the picture of Kenneth Hayne handing over the report to Frydenberg and not smiling, but Frydenberg's press conference where he said, we are going to clean this up, blah, 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 really, really emphatic. And then, of course, they use COVID as a smokescreen to just dump all that, basically. But the public and the political class could not deny that, hang on, that proved that the complaints of all those victims over the years was right, that there was a big problem. The second thing is this is the first inquiry in the new Labor government. Labor's been in opposition for 9 years. And in that time, they've talked the talk. Now they get to walk the walk. Are they serious or are they not? And there are people that, John and I are aware of in the Labor ranks who definitely seem serious. My evaluation is they're serious, but they've been just this new into the government. They've already been tapped on the shoulder and told, pull your head in, right? And they're not happy, and they've made noises to indicate they're probably not happy. But the machine, which is now, Labor's in bed with these massive industry super funds that are all got huge amounts of money, and the head of the Banking Association, Anna Bligh, and the Banking Association never complains about ASIC. She's a former Labor premier, and Labor, if they got away with it, if they could get away with it, would prefer not to have a fight with the banks. But that would really show them up to be absolute frauds, and that's actually a difficult thing for a politician to accept. So there'll be a lot of grassroots or backbench pressure on the Labor Party to do this seriously. And the fact that as things stands right now, there's two competing royal inquiries, one chaired by Senator Bragg and one chaired by a Labor Senator, Deb O'Neill. I reckon that can only be good. That means that you're going to get. Can you still hear me, Martin?
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay, sorry, my screen froze. I think that competition is going to help to, the only way they can outdo each other is expose more of the truth, right? So this is a new dynamic with the Labor government. We'll see what comes out of that. And of course, the third factor is the great John Adams, as he sort of indicated. John's a bit of a Johnny-come-lately to this ASIC issue. Some of us have been at it for a while, but I do take my hat off to him. I'm not just being a smart ass by saying that. I do take this was great work that he did. He got involved with the Sterling inquiry and paid really close attention to how ASIC worked, get his own issue. But the report really got attention and in the right places, right? The report presented a virtually undeniable case. And that kind of this dynamic that we're part of tonight, this social media politics where we're always raising awareness of these issues and drilling right down into them and getting the public to engage in these issues. This wasn't happening in 2018 or very much. You were just starting. I mean, start of 2018, you had 400 subscribers, Martin. There's more people tuning in live right now than you had at the start of 2018 as subscribers.
It's true.
This is a much bigger phenomenon. John certainly made a name for himself, and that is the fact that Andrew Bragg was keen to go on your channel and have that discussion is a case in point. When politicians are coming to you, that's because there's a center of gravity in this process, right? And that's different. And I think there's a real potential there. So one of the things that John and I are working hard on at the moment is to get the message out to all the victims through all the different victims groups, use trees of communication, get those anyone with an experience of ASIC to make submissions and make these quite powerful inquiries. So I would say that you'd agree with that, wouldn't you, John?
Sure. But Robbie, the thing is, like, people in the chat are asking the question: if you are Prime Minister tonight, will you if we want to get this economy back under control and actually have a sustainable economy, we need a depression. And you guys hate Joseph Lyons for what he did in 1931. You think he's the devil incarnate, and he actually fixed the problem. So people have noticed in the chat, you didn't answer the question: will you put this economy into a depression, and would you shrink the debt?
We would shrink the debt, but not in this sort of cavalier way where you just set out to trigger a depression. what you need to do is what Joe Lyons' predecessor wasn't allowed to do. The other side of the equation is the question of means, as I talked about before. And there's a whole story. I don't know how much time we got tonight to go through it all, but Ted Theodore was not allowed to use the Commonwealth Bank to invest in the productive enterprises of Australia to be able to get Australia back on its feet that way. The Commonwealth Bank...
Ted Theodore wanted to do QE and Joseph Lyons was opposed to QE. I'm opposed to QE. It's been a complete disaster the last 2 years. And so the collapse of the Scullin government was...
No. QE, what we call QE is putting is a blank check, creating money to prop up private banks. That's the last thing Ted Theodore wanted to do. He wanted to use the Commonwealth Bank to put $18 million into the economy, into agriculture industries, which was our main industries in those days, and public works, to get people into jobs and get our economy moving, the real economy, the productive economy moving again. And hang on. Do you know who actually did that policy? Adolf Hitler in 1934. And did he get the German economy moving? He did. What happened in 1945? Hyperinflation. Franklin Roosevelt did it as well.
Okay, but what was the consequences of Hitler's program in the end? It was hyperinflation. So by the end of World War II, now hyperinflation 1945 in Germany was nothing like 1923. Well, but this program
that was
printing money.
I think that was a war. Hitler built a war machine. You don't have to invest and create a war machine, right? You can do the productive things without the war. That's what made it productive. So the real comparison is what we were able to do in Australia after World War II. That's the real comparison. When we had the greatest public debt in our history, 140% of GDP in 1948, yet the Chifley government embarked on the single biggest, most expensive project in our history, the Snowy Mountain Scheme. It was 15% of GDP, which is the equivalent of $300 billion today. So we've got 50% of GDP debt now. And he had 140% of GDP debt, and he embarked on a $300 billion project. But by the time that project was finished, 25 years later, we were virtually debt-free because that sort of investment expanded our economy massively. That's what we did for the 25 years after World War II, assisted by things like the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system and the gold reserve exchange system, which was one of the most productive periods in history, but it was because governments actually invested. We built the car industry. We did a lot of those things. We had this massively productive economy, and they made sure, because of the war, we invested in building up a productive industry because of the war, and they made sure we kept it going. In fact, we had more manufacturing in the mid-1960s as a percent of GDP than we had in 1945 at the end of the war. We peaked at over like 35% of GDP or something in manufacturing. That's how we became how we handled debt in a way that didn't bankrupt the people. Because my argument with John is his formula, if you just pull the rug out from under, we're going to smash the debt. It's premised on this idea that what drives an economy is the sum total of all the consumer decisions of the free market. That's what drives the economy, not governments helping make decisions and saying we're going to have this strategic direction. No, that's just what drives the economy. So you created, if those decisions get out of whack and you have debt bubbles, then you've got to pop that by pulling the rug out and taking away the capacity for people to spend and make those decisions. That's not how we used to run the economy. We used to run the economy by saying this is what we need. People that we elected, wise people, because we had a healthier democracy back then, said this is what we need to do, and we embarked and did those things. And the only reason, there's a very simplistic view of Joe Lyons. History is written by the victors, and in his case, he was the victor thanks to Rupert Murdoch's father and those kind of forces that were able to demonise the Ted Theodore Scullin government as if they were communist revolutionaries about to destroy Australia, totally terrify the people. But the reason that Ted Theodore wasn't able to do what he wanted to do as the elected Treasurer of Australia is because an unelected person, the Governor of the Commonwealth Bank, Sir Robert Gibson, point blank refused. And that led to a Royal Commission in 1936, and that Royal Commission had to concede that the elected government of the day must be the final authority over the banking system, because that was a case of the private bankers ganging up and using their power to stop an elected government. And that's what you're defending by defending Scullin. You're defending the power of private finance over elected government. I believe in a democratic system, John. And that is what we showed that what could do, what Ted Theodore wanted to do, we show what it could do after World War II.
So hang on. I'm going to make 2 points. The first point is that the banks didn't basically collapse the Scullin government. I mean, 5 Labor MPs, including Joseph Lyons, who's the deputy PM, resigned from cabinet on principle, and they went to the crossbench. So the banks didn't have it like. So
but
there were people
the politics. You're glossing over how extreme the politics was of the day.
Hang on.
Of course, they recruited a couple of rats.
Thing is, but what you haven't told the audience is that Joseph Lyons won 3 elections in a row. He won the biggest victory in 1931 in Australian federal history. He died in office in 1939, and even though we didn't have opinion polls back in the 1930s, he's probably more popular than Bob Hawke was in terms of the 1980s. But so I mean, phenomenal.
You don't like Franklin Roosevelt, but he won 4 elections in a row.
Well, I mean, look, we're not here to talk about FDR. We're here to talk about domestic policy. But just in terms of your prime ministership. So basically, if I hear you correctly, you're saying that you would create effectively more debt, but you would redirect that debt into other parts of the economy.
Well, yeah, because let's go back to the China thing. You're so hung up on this. Debt is the opposite, is the other side of the ledger from credit. You demonize all debt as if it's all bad by definition. No, borrowing money to go do something productive is one of the best things a financial system does. That debt is good, not a necessary evil. It is good. It is good to be able to do that. People who have the capital, they can put it in a banking system, and that idle capital can then be used for people who have energy and innovation, innovative ideas to go and create wealth. That is a good system. That's a credit system is a good system. But if you go and borrow debt so that you can buy investments on the stock market on margin, right, and that sort of thing, speculate in paper, that is crazy. And there's the guy who invented the sort of established the Commonwealth Bank, King O'Malley, he has a great quote about the difference between fog wealth and real wealth, and how real wealth is slow and it's patient and it builds up over time. Fog wealth is just moving paper around. And that's what we've become. And so there is a massive difference between what is underlying China's debt, a really productive economy, and what is underlying America's debt, which is just a paper casino.
Well, hang on. You know what? In the 1980s,
and that means China can service its debt.
Well, hang on. No, look, the thing is, like, what are you talking about? In the 1980s, what did they say about the Japanese economy? The Japanese had a huge productive economy. They were revolutionizing manufacturing. They were going to take over the world. And it was all built on a fantasy. And then when the debt bubble collapsed in 1989, I mean, look at Japan now. So again,
that particular debt bubble was much bigger than anything in China.
Look, hang on. Look, I want to finish this point. So in terms of the Chinese, absolutely they have, in terms of a huge debt problem, that will come to some sort of resolution. Here's the thing: anytime there is a problem in the property sector in China, what does Beijing do? It basically it either pumps more liquidity from the People's Bank of China, or you have some additional national stimulus, or they particularly, I mean, one of the biggest bubbles in China is the local government sector. I mean, they have been wildly out of control in terms of public sector debt, the local government debt sector. So here's the thing. So anytime the Chinese are in trouble, they prop the bubble up just like we do. So again, this is survival economics.
No, that's actually a misunderstanding. What I was saying before is that the Chinese actually took steps to collapse their own property debt bubble. They raised margins on real estate loans and all those sort of things to bring this under control in a controlled way, something that Australia would never have considered doing if inflation hadn't have got out of control. But also, it's not the main game in town, and you've got to take that into account. But because we just diverted to that, as an example, again, the issue for Australia is collapse the debt in the real estate bubble, because that's the debt that's killing us, right? And the bank's foreign debt that's feeding that, and all those things that Peter Brain goes through, right? How we've got all this debt. Peter Brain goes through. We've got all this debt and nothing to show for it because it's gone into real estate. We should be collapsing that bubble, but that's why we have put forward policy ideas that we've taken from Australian history of a moratorium on foreclosures, so that the people who live in homes can be, as much as possible, inoculated from that, because they didn't cause the problem, right? It doesn't come. The economy is not based on the sum decisions of all the individual consumers in it. These are massive political decisions. So pop that bubble for sure, but at the same time, be investing massively in the things that can get people into a productive economy, and not just in the cities, but all over. Let's spread the population out all over Australia.
Hang on. So if you pop the property bubble, but people are not going to be removed from the homes. Basically, what are you doing to property rights? I mean, because at the end of the day, you need property to be exchanged from an existing buyer to a new buyer in order to allow property prices to be able to readjust. You need to stabilise the system at the lower value before you let it be a free-for-all. What do you want? What we had in America after the GFC? No. Here's the thing. Because all those banks claimed their property rights when they forced 12 million people out on the streets. After they had been bailed out by the government, they forced 12 million people out in the streets. That was a crime against humanity, what was allowed to be done in America after the GFC. What happened in the pandemic in the last 2 years with rents and landlords, where property rights were effectively suspended, and the government told landlords, this is how you're going to run your property, and this is how you're going to run your private property and your commercial business. That's exactly what you want to do. You want to basically copy the Daniel Andrews playbook and actually implement the moratorium we're talking about has a real history, not to the pandemic, but back to the Great Depression. In every state in Australia, in the United States, etc., these kind of moratoriums were put in place, so you didn't have just massive social dislocation. What do you prefer? Well, what do I prefer? I prefer 1921, where in the United States you had a bigger depression, but it was 18 months. Unemployment was able to turn around very quickly because you had a laissez-faire economy that was able to adjust because of free market forces. So, I've always wondered about that example, because that's the storybook version. But the fact that within less than a decade you had the biggest stock market crash in America, the biggest and most devastating stock market crash in America's history, the economy that built back after that 1921 experience obviously wasn't that good. Well, here's the thing. They got the inflation under control. They collapsed the debt in the US, and the economy was able to roll back. Unemployment turned around within 18 months. So when I say we need to collapse the economy, we need to shrink the debt. Yeah, so it's going to cause a huge issue with unemployment and a huge issue in terms of homelessness and all those sort of things. But what's not to like? But no, hang on. One of the reasons why Australia had the second highest level of unemployment in 1932 behind the Germans was because we had this crazy policy of centralized wage fixing. So we basically, the federal government basically controlled all wages in the economy, and you didn't allow the labour market to be able to flexibly adjust. So the more free the market is, the quicker the adjustment of the economy will be, and we can turn the economy around faster. But again, so because you know, Robbie, if you notice how you answered the question, you said, okay, you talk about debt in the theoretical component, but if you're Prime Minister tonight, you've got to deal with the central issue now. Is you've got the biggest debt bubble in Australian history, and you've got to do something with it. And so what I'm hearing you say is you're gonna because if you pop the bubble, the banks are gone. So what are you going to do with the banks? And then you're going to say everyone gets to stay in their home. So you're basically going to suspend property rights, and you're going to have a full-on socialist national policy. And obviously, if you do that, you're going to undermine completely the entire market economy. Well, the free market banks
are happy to undermine the entire market economy when it suits them. I'm saying you do it. I'm saying you do it to suit the people, but it's a temporary measure for a year or so to stabilise the system, and then you let the market, the housing market, etc., work again. But at that time, you're not going to have banks allowed to pump up a property bubble. Before, we should never have let that get out of control. It's all about. See, in your formula, John, there's a lot of elite people that are never going to be affected, that are going to get to foreclose on a lot of people, and the people who are more to blame for the crisis will end up from the crisis much fatter than everybody else, and you have a lot of human misery and suffering. I'm saying history shows us that there's a role for the government that's beholden to the people, not to elite business interests and rich guys, to make sure that the people are served first in whatever restructuring has to take place, because there's going to be a restructuring, and it's going to be as a result of government action, one way or the other.
Okay, I'm going to come in here because I want to move the conversation on slightly further insofar that.
Well, one last thing. Can I just say what people have been listening to is like a preview of our 6 a.m. morning arguments.
Yeah, well, I knew it was going to be interesting because there are some very different perspectives here. But there's a couple of interesting observations. One that Jason put up a little while ago, which I thought was really interesting, was this. What's your opinion on the banks coercively controlling some of the clients in trouble who are about to lose their house, potentially offering them, for example, 40-year terms? In other words, the banks trying to sort of stretch things out, because there's a lot of that going on at the moment, right? And what I'm seeing at the moment in the way that this debt issue is being dealt with is it's not being dealt with. What they're doing is doing more of the same, only extended. And Jason, thank you very much for the super chat as well, of course. But that's a really important point, I think, because I'm not sure that you can just go on doing what we've been doing for the last 20, 30, 40 years and expect a different outcome, which takes you to a conclusion that you've got to find a different path.
Well, the only thing I'll say, Martin, is two things. So on the 40-year mortgages, it's just another band-aid to in terms of to allow the perpetuation in terms of hang on. Sorry, look, I've just got a private thing I've got to do. I've got to unlock the door.
I'll just say a few things. No, that's right. It is a band-aid, and you can see by the actions of Labor federally and the state Labor governments. That everything is still, and there's an election down here, well, soon, this month, in a few days or whatever. I'm not even sure. Is it this Saturday? I should look it up. Soon. There's an election down here, but both sides have wheeled out policies to support the labour market. Of course, they call it helping people get into housing, right? So I think Matthew Guy is going to forgive, just scrap or suspend stamp duty for 12 months or something, right? I forget what it is anyway, something like that. And they package it up in lovely smelling roses and whatever, but it's a big turd of more props for the housing market. This is, and the federal Labor is exactly the same. Their policy. What's their policy? Oh, yeah, the buying a percentage of the equity in the home, right? And that'll help some more people into the market, but keeping these prices up. And what they're dead set against is letting the market actually correct. And whereas I would say take away all the props from the housing market, watch what happens, but then do the things necessary to make sure that the public survive the process. And
I don't know whether you saw, but today Treasury put out their discussion paper for the idea of getting the superannuation industry to effectively subsidise and pay for housing, right? Which is another example of going around the circle again. It's not solving the fundamental issue, right? All it is doing is just moving the problem. Yeah. And I have a real big problem with that. Going back to the financial system on the edge, what we're actually doing is getting a further deadly embrace between the superannuation system and housing. it's not solving the fundamental
that would
problem.
be terrible. Whole heap more money available to come into the housing market.
And guess what that does? That puts more upward pressure on property. It creates even more pressure on households in terms of wanting to get into the market. And then, of course, what you end up doing is effectively buying a bit of a house, which, of course, is what the Labor solution is. You buy a bit of a house and then buy a bit more later. But at some point, if your income goes up, you've got to buy more house. So
that's right.
it's not really a very user-friendly option. And I guess, Robbie, what I was thinking about here was, there have been lots and lots of attempts at trying to solve point solutions to this debt problem, right? And it completely fails because we continue to play by the old rules, right? And that's what I was trying to get at in this whole conversation. What is it? What is the underlying philosophical substructure that's driving the same behaviour? And it's neoliberalism, it's the market, it's all of those things that we've touched on. And
that's my view.
Yeah, and I don't see how just doing more of the same, even if you tweak it slightly at the margins, is going to do anything other than perpetuate. And the model I use is it's the financial services event horizon. Basically, more and more of the economy expands and it sucks more of the economy in. So you end up with everything effectively being financialized. And in the process, you've lost actually manufacturing, you've lost home ownership, you've lost pretty much everything. But the financial system is there in splendid isolation, creating value off nothing for the 1%. And then what you do is you end up with the likes of BlackRock coming in afterwards and just sweeping up the property that nobody else can afford. I mean, that is an absolute nightmare. And yet that's what we're doing.
No, for sure. And the other one sweeping up now is like Vanguard is eyeing off this $30 billion in fees on super, I heard today. And they want to come in. Just hang on a second. I just got to let someone do something. You can go. My daughter needed to pass behind me.
No, that's fine. That's not a problem. I think John Allen's may be back as well now.
Yes. Yeah. No, the only thing I'll say, Martin, is that this whole system has to come to an end. I mean, you articulated it famously in 2018 with Control-Alt-Delete. Yes. And again, I mean, can I say, I mean, in his previous in terms of what Robbie was saying before, Robbie was giving the perception that he's with the people and I'm somehow protecting private interests. I mean, the reality is that the Citizens Party gives the language of anti-bank, but the only person willing to collapse the banks is me. Because if I was PM tonight, I would raise interest rates dramatically. I wouldn't have any supports for the banks. The banks would be basically in a financial crisis within 24 hours, and we would collapse the banks. We would restructure them. We would get rid of these toxic mortgages, and we would shrink the debt. And yes, that comes at a huge economic cost. But I'm willing to push the button. So the consequences of my policies is no. Hang on. The consequences of my policy is the so-called banker fat cats that Robbie is against. They're all out on the street. They're all gonna lose their jobs under my policy because their banks will be bust, and they will have no bank to run. And so when you do a banking restructure, look, what I would do is I wouldn't have the four pillars. I would have more banks because one of the biggest design problems in the banking system is too big to fail. So I would have maybe 6 to 8 commercial banks, rather than having the big four. And then obviously those banks would have different corporate leadership compared to the ones that they have now. And yes, shareholders of the banks would take a huge loss in the process. But obviously those, the great thing about capitalism is that those people who actually exercise prudent economic decisions, who preserve the capital, they're the ones that will be able to buy these banks at a penny of the dollar. Those new shareholders will be able to install their new leadership of the banks. And all these people that Robbie says he's against, they're out on the street. But that's what I would do. I would end the reign of the people that Robbie's against. And under his policy, those fat cat bankers are not put out on the street. They survive under Robbie's policy. And that's the key difference, that I'm willing to push the nuclear button.
Well, then you misunderstand our policy big time. because we're talking about bringing the private banks absolutely under control, to rein them in big time. When you say the people who've been careful with their capital, et cetera, John, it's not going to be people like you that buy the new banks. It's going to be the same big wealthy interests that always survive these crises. And they will perpetuate their power all over again.
Hang on. Even Martin's data, speaks to the following point, that if you look at the distribution of debt, particularly the household sector, most of the debt is held by rich people in this country. So if you collapse the debt bubble, who on a proportional basis are going to have most of the harm? It's rich people.
I don't mean rich people. I mean the plutocracy. There's rich people, then there's this strata. It's not the 1%, it's the 0.1% way up here that have always existed. They think that they're a power above governments. Whereas the alternative approach is, because it's one thing to say what you're saying, it's another thing to do it. Whereas what I'm pointing to as the alternative approach is what happened in our own history. And just look at the 25 years after World War II, thanks to the trajectory that Ben Chifley put us on.
The only thing, to the point of it's different to say that than compared to actually do it. 2 months ago when I met with ASIC, they thought it was crazy when I said I want to inquire, and here we are. So what people should realise is that when I say I'm going to push the button, I fully intend to push the button, and people should be under no illusion that I actually have the results to be able to do it.
Okay.
Oh, we're under no illusion.
No, absolutely. No, I think that's right. Now, I want to move on to two quick things before we close, because we could go on for hours.
We're out of time already.
Yeah, we are close.
I called him a gate crasher today on Twitter, and he's proved it.
Okay, two questions. The first question, I want to go up a bit, right? Because not only do we have in Australia, we have ASIC and APRA and the RBA, and that we've got this international superstructure of the World Economic Forum, the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, all of those entities, right? Now, I have a theory that they're part of the problem too, because they are also driven by this same neoliberal philosophy, this same idea that that they know what's best, so they cascade, if you like, top down, a whole set of directives as to what countries should do, and then you find the politicians in each country say, oh, that's a good idea, we'll go and do that, right? For me, that's part of this problem too, because their overall natural stomping ground is this same neoliberal philosophy. So I think that's one of the issues that we should also recognise. We're not doing this in isolation, just in Australia. Yeah. This is actually a global problem. Right?
Yeah, it is. And that's where this, the sovereignty question is quite important. We need a sovereign financial system. I will just be clear on the difference between the World Economic Forum and the rest of that. You said that's an informal body. It actually has zero power over Australia that we don't want to give it, because it's just a talk fest. But it can be influential. The other ones are actually members of. We are signed up to. We agree to abide by their rules, etc. They are real institutions, and they have been part of what's called one name for it is the Washington Consensus. Post World War II, that has been an authority over the world economy, but it's been enforced by the US dollar, and that is what's breaking down. And we are finding ourselves in the minority, sticking to the sinking ship of the US dollar. That's geopolitically, that's a big deal. But we know that the directives we get from these institutions are these neoliberal directives, and so we need to take stock of the damage that's done, and that's why we push for policies like at least bring back a public bank to compete with the private banks, so that we can break that neoliberal stranglehold over the financial system and get an investment vehicle to do the things that will benefit Australia, and as a beginning, and more can flow from that.
And then coming down locally, the other fallout is we know that now, look, we've covered the branch closures, we've covered the war on cash. There are things happening locally which again I would argue is connected with this global top-down thou shalt do this, right, which is manifesting itself in local policies that are actually killing local communities, strangling their ability to be able to thrive and survive. The banks are looking to cut costs, so they're taking branches out, they're taking ATMs out, they're trying to remove and restrict cash, putting us into a digital environment. And guess what? Digital means more control. So that's another angle on all of this too, which is again worth, because it isn't disconnected. All of these things are part of a big picture, right? And that's really what I wanted to try and get to in this show, which is why so much of this stuff is complicated to try and unpick. But it is all connected, isn't it, Robbie?
Well, we started off talking about essentially, Martin, how the financial system serves itself.
Yep.
And those institutions you've named are actually the institutions of the global financial system, which have completely changed from their original purpose. And they are there now to make sure that the global financial system survives in its own right, irrespective of what it's doing in the real world. That's what they do. The IMF, the World Bank, and especially the Bank for International Settlements, that is its role, right? It represents the world central banks, and they're there to look after the welfare of the private banks. And so things like going digital and cashless is a way they've identified to shore up the power and profits of the global financial system. Outfits like the WEF come along and help popularize the idea, right? And down at the retail level in Australia, what you're getting, I'm going to share my screen in a minute as I prepared with you earlier. I just want to show the viewers these graphics. What you're getting is a message from the government, that the government believes, and from the banks, that, we're shutting branches and we're ripping out ATMs because people are moving their banking online. That's what you're being told, right? And let me just prove it and prove it's a lie, an absolute lie. So just have a look at this.
Share your screen first, Robbie, and I'll switch it up for you. Okay,
there we go. There we go. Bring up that. Okay. So I got these graphics from Dale Webster. Martin and I did an interview with Dale Webster a few weeks ago. She's done a brilliant job. But what happened is National Australia Bank put out a whole heap of fact sheets, they call it, to branches that they were closing to explain why they're closing them, right? And there's a whole bunch. There's about 10 of them. I'm going to show you enough that you'll get the point. So this is how they all open the same way. NAB Laurieton in this case is closing, and then look at what I've highlighted there. More and more, our customers are choosing. Note that word, choosing to do their banking online over the phone or by video conference, and then by their own admission, because of these changes, i.e. the people choosing to go online, we've made the difficult decision. It's broken our heart to close our NAB bank. Now, before I get into the actual details, just bear in mind that since the late 90s, banks have been aggressively shutting branches. And it wasn't because of digital back then. They're full of shit. These banks want to shut branches, and they look for every opportunity to pull the rug out from under people in terms of service, etc. But so that's what they've claimed about Laurieton. Then look at this on page 2 of Laurieton. Can you see the second graphic? This tells you, look at this first one. How is banking changing? Here's how our NAB Laurieton customers are banking. 91% who use this branch, the Laurieton branch, are registered for online banking and or telephone banking. And you think, wow, that is impressive. I mean, clearly people are using online banking. But wait a minute. Look at the next one. Of that 91%, 25% are active online banking or telephone banking users. And right there, you see the lie. Because what's the definition of an active bank user? I mean, I use my banking every week, every few days sometimes. I'm pretty active, right? If only 25% of those registered for online banking are active, yet 91% are registered, that confirms what I was told by someone who represents bank workers, that they're under extreme pressure to sign up their customers, and this is perverse, sign up their customers to online banking, knowing that if they're successful enough, they'll lose their jobs for doing it, because then they won't have a job left anymore. And so the nana leaves the bank with a piece of paper that's got her password and username having no clue what to do with it, but she's registered for online banking. And they're using that excuse to shut it down, because the truth is, how many are active users? Not even a quarter, because that's 25 of the 91%. Not even a quarter of that bank's branch users were active online users. And that's Laurieton. And just so you see that this is a uniform problem. Let me just go through a bunch of this. Is a whole bunch more branches. This is Bombala, 89% registered, 31% are actually active. This one is Cooma, 91% registered, 27% active. This is Murwillumbah, 90% registered, 26% active. Narooma, 93%, 22%. And I want you guys, this is a big enough sample you can draw conclusions. That's why I just want to go through them all, even though you're getting the theme by now. 91% registered in Northamptonshire, 25% active. 85% registered in Port Melbourne, 19% active. Port Melbourne doesn't want to do online banking, clearly, and that's a city branch, and a well-off part of the city as well. Strathalbyn, 89% registered, 23% active. And whatever this one, Tincan Bay, 93%, 28% active. Now, if that's a consistent picture across all those NAB branches, you can bet your bottom dollar it's a consistent picture across all the big four banks right around Australia. And they are lying when they tell the government, like in this regional banking task force, that they're closing branches because people have moved online. No, this is social engineering. They are forcing people online. And today, just before we started, I read the National Australia Bank submission to the Regional Banking Task Force. I'll stop that now. I read NAB's submission, and those bastards at NAB actually said that their backup for this process of closing branches and shifting people online is Bank at Post. Part of their plan is to take full advantage of Bank at Post, not as a postal bank like we're advocating, where they will lose their customers, but knowing that they can retain their customers through Bank at Post. But then they have this little revealing line in there. They claim to the government that Bank at Post is so good that it can handle over 90% of the transactions that their branch handled. 90%. This is not a bank that knows that they've lost most of their customers to online banking. This is a bank that knows they haven't lost most of their customers to online banking. They're going to either force them to online banking or force them onto the Bank at Post, which means Bank at Post, as it is currently structured, forcing them onto the taxpayer. They will be exploiting the taxpayer. And when they sign their last agreement with Bank at Post, after Christine Holgate was forced out, they slashed in half what they were prepared to pay, which is $10 million. That would barely cover the cost for NAB of 5 branches. And for the cost of what that used to cost them to maintain 5 branches, they are forcing dozens and dozens, if not over 100 branches in the last few years onto Bank at Post, and they're pocketing the profits from doing that, right? And they're going to pocket the profits from that, from eventually a cut of all our transactions, right? Because they do get a cut of the Bank at Post transactions as well, a very hefty cut, sometimes $4 fees, even though they don't provide the surface. And then, of course, all the data that comes from internet banking. And as you pointed out, they're doing this so aggressively now. There's actually, we've crossed a boundary here. You're pretty convinced, Martin, that this is desperation stuff from the banks because they're in so much trouble. That's why they're aggressively shutting these branches.
Yeah, so if you think about a branch, it's got quite a few people in it. There's a lot of costs involved, a lot of physical real estate, etc. So sometimes they don't own the branch. They actually lease the branch. But it's a big cost. And so the way that they account for this is that all of the profit generated from the products are actually held centrally, so you don't get any profit down to the branch. So you've just got a load of costs, no value, and then it's a massive cost, we've got to close it because our costs are just way too high. So it's social engineering at its worst, and what it is doing is it's devaluing and frankly being disingenuous to many communities. And it's not just in regional Australia now, it's actually in other areas too. You can go look at in around suburban Sydney and Melbourne and elsewhere as well. And down here in the region where I am, we used to have a number of NAB branches around. They've all gone. So if I wanted to bank with NAB, I'd have to go down 12 kilometres down the road. So I'm now with a local customer-owned bank. Customer-owned bank, meaning it's owned by the people who own it, right? And it's got
and they seem to like having branches.
They've got a branch down the road, and they're getting, they can do all the same stuff. And this is a really important point. I want to make as part of this conversation. Financial services on the edge, right? The old way of doing financial services is decaying and falling apart, but there are also some new shoots, and I actually think the customer-owned banking story is one that's really, really important. Unfortunately, many people haven't woken up to this yet. They actually don't drive the same profit motive for what they do. They're there to serve their members, and guess what? They actually offer good products and services and actually good rates, and they're still down there on the high street. So I now go down and get my cash out of the ATM down the road rather than, what was there before. But the point is, this is all part of this massive canvas, right? And going right back to where we started this conversation, where we have huge amounts of debt, where we have, many households now really struggling because of the high interest rates and all those things. The financial system is not fit for purpose. That is really, really clear. And all of the efforts from the current regulators and the government and all those things are just putting little bits of sticking plaster over this massive problem. It's not going to solve it. And the question is, do we have the ambition and the vision to be able to actually shape banking and put it back in its box? And rather than making banking a profit center in its own right, okay, the banking system should be supporting the real economy and real people and real businesses. And that would be the first step I would take ultimately to be able to actually craft an alternative narrative about how financial services should work. And guess what? 20, 30, 40 years ago, banking was boring, right? Banking was not high risk. Banking was not an end in itself, but it was effective in actually supporting the broader economy. And that's where I think we have to go back to.
Yep. And I think we've got the lessons from Australian history to draw on. It's not rocket science. You just need there's a way that you can force these big four banks to compete. There's an interesting German economist, Richard Werner. People are probably familiar with him. He likes pointing out that the strength of Germany's financial system is its many community banks, right? And I think that is a much better approach. I mean, John was alluding to that somewhat than the big four kind of, or the four pillars kind of approach. But you want to have a public player that can set a tone, right? A national bank that can set a tone, and that's what our bank would do. And it does come down to it, because it means that ultimately the people are in charge, right? And that's the principle you don't want to get away from. Yep. Little historical trivia: when the world's first postal bank was started by the Brits, actually, by William Gladstone, Prime Minister William Gladstone, when he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And he has this quote. I haven't got it perfectly. I should have prepared for this, but he said something like this. He was talking about how bruised he was after this fight to start this postal bank, and he said the hinge of the whole situation was the private banks didn't want to have a government entity, and he concluded by saying the money power was to remain supreme and unquestioned. That's a direct quote from William Gladstone. The money power was to remain supreme and unquestioned, and that's what they want. And they've always wanted that. And right now, since in Australia for 25 years, since 1996, that's what they've had, right? And we want to chop them off at the knees and bring back a public bank. And our campaign is going gangbusters because of this regional branch closure question, right? People are paying attention all over the country, and they're passing motions of support, etc., because they know it's a crisis and something's got to give. Absolutely. John, are you still there? Or have you disappeared?
No. The thing is, there's people have asked what happened to me. I'm just sitting in silence like an obedient servant to my two masters.
Yes, John, we don't quite believe that, I'm afraid. Okay.
Thank you, Violet. I think I do claim a little bit of credit for us that we are in John's more generous moments, Martin. He admits that we got him thinking about banking more than he did before.
Yeah. Well, I want to make a couple of closing remarks. The other point about the banking system, right? A number of people ask me all the time, is the banking system safe? Should I take my money out of the banking system? What about deposit bail-in, et cetera, right? And my perspective is this: at the moment, I actually think the banking system in Australia is relatively safe, but it is creaking a bit at the seams, particularly around this derivatives exposure and particularly around the bad debts that are clearly going to come up. But it is reasonably well capitalised. But the point I'd make is that if a bank ever got bailed in Australia, in other words, if somebody found that their deposits were converted into equity in a bank, the first time that happened, the banking system would collapse in Australia, wouldn't it?
Yeah. It's insanity. It's insanity.
Why? No. Well, hang on. We just saw totalitarianism in Victoria, and Daniel Andrews is about to win re-election just because you see extreme behaviour by the banks. I mean, we have enough people who are willing to accept authoritarian control in this country. So why would the banking system collapse? I mean, if you think that there's going to be an armed revolution against the banks because of bail-in, no. We just saw what happened the last 2 years. People just sit down and just take whatever the politicians tell them to do.
Well, the question is that bail-in will destroy confidence in the banks.
Yep,
that's been the issue with it all along. They've had to do it ever since Cyprus. They've only got away with it in these smaller cases in Italy and Spain, but it bloody destroyed the confidence of those people in those towns in Italy and Spain where it was done to. But bail-in on a scale like one of our big four banks, it would be absolutely crazy. There's an element of it being, the government does, or the system does things to try and shore up some confidence, but it's just, they're not geniuses. These people, they will be the masters of their own destruction.
Sure. Well, so perhaps the more likely scenario is that the RBA is just going to print more money, and then obviously provide the banks more liquidity so that the show continues to go. But again, Martin, to the point that you made about both these international institutions, but also the social engineering by the banks. I mean, one of the key points that I didn't make before is the IMF has said that our big four banks put together is the equivalent of a globally systemically important bank. So under my policy of dramatically raising interest rates within 24 hours, not only do we stop the banks implementing a fully digital totalitarian society, we actually have the capacity, Australia. So the RBA, we can collapse the global economy in 24 hours. We have that power. And dare I say, if we did have that power, we would collapse the debt bubble in China. I think the CCP would be removed through a people's revolution in China. But also we would see that the global financial system would come to its knees. So Australia has enormous power. And we can turn the horror story off within 24 hours if we had the right political leadership in Canberra, someone who was willing to, and these are very specific steps, within the first hour, end central bank independence, call a meeting of the RBA board, dramatically raise interest rates, give a press conference and say we're popping the bubble. And then obviously from that, you will have to dramatically go into austerity and cut government spending because of with high interest rates, the government wouldn't be able to afford the interest rates on the bonds, and we would have a depression. But in the process, we restore a sound economy, we restore political and civil rights, we end the totalitarian leadership of this country, and we basically are the catalyst for a more
hang on. Hang
on. Let me finish the sentence. We will be the catalyst to pop the global debt bubble and to end the horror regime that we've seen over the last few years, both in the West but also in the East. And so Australia can play a pivotal role in that leadership, but it just takes a group of people, maybe one person in particular, who's willing to push the button. And unfortunately, I don't think Mr. Barwick is up to the job.
You don't think? I just wanted to take up this issue of restoring civil and political rights. You think under the depression conditions that you're going to enforce on the Australian people, they're just going to take it lying down? There's not going to be massive social dislocation.
No.
Unrest, and how are you going to handle that, John?
No, hang on. The point I was trying to make was Martin was talking about how the banks, and you also made the point that the banks are engaged in a social engineering campaign through digital transformation. If you collapse the banks through raising interest rates and popping the property bubble, those people in those banks doing this social engineering program, they're gone, and the program ends.
Well, you can change the law and make them gone too. You don't have to engineer a depression for them to be gone. You stop them from doing it. You set up a public bank that is not driven by social engineering to get us off cash, and then the banks have to compete with that.
No, but remember, Martin just said before that part of the motivation for this program is because of the cost structure. So obviously, with the huge debt burden at the banks and with the rising interest rates, it creates a whole host of liquidity and capital stability ratio for the banks. And obviously, they're looking to cut costs. So how do they do it? They close the branches down. So even if you create a public bank to compete against the Big Four, the economics of the banking system have not been fixed by a public bank option. Now, I'm not.
That's true. That part's true. I'm just saying you don't have to. It depends on what your particular outcome is. But the other thing is that the banks have to be put through receivership and completely cleaned out and shut down if absolutely necessary. But you're going to have to deal with the debt bubble in the banks for sure. But you do it in a controlled way, not an uncontrolled way, because I'm telling you, if you engineer the depression that you like talking about, you will create such social unrest that you'll turn into Hitler to keep it under control. It won't be dictator Dan, it'll be dictator Adams.
Well, hang on. The biggest depression in Australian history was in 1892. Did we turn into anarchy? No. The thing is, particularly in Melbourne took the brunt the most. While there were some examples of horrific social dislocation, to a large degree, Victorian and Melbourne society was able to hold steady.
Are you calling Australians placid?
No. Well, look, I'm telling you a historical fact. I mean, let me also give you another example. I mean, the point I'm trying to drive at is it depends on domestic culture, but also the strength of civil institutions. Have a look at what happened when what was that huge hurricane during the presidency of George W. Bush that led to huge
Katrina.
Yeah, look at what happened with the Hurricane Katrina, and then look at what happened in Japan with the in terms of the meltdown and the nuclear meltdown in terms of Fukushima. The Japanese people remained calm, even though they were going through a nuclear significant domestic event. There wasn't social dislocation, there wasn't chaos, but in America there was. So we can go through an uncontrolled depression, and if we have enough moral character and cultural resilience, we can get through it, just like the Japanese did in 2011. Whereas if we if we're selfish and we in our civil institutions and our civil morality collapses, we could end up like what happened with the Americans in the South with Hurricane Katrina. But again, it is up to us as sovereign people as to what that outcome will be. So it doesn't necessarily mean that an uncontrolled depression, and an uncontrolled depression, all that means is that the process just runs faster, and you get to the other side of the process quicker, and so the economy can be on a more stable and sustainable basis in a short amount of time. So all I want to do is the old adage: if you have a Band-Aid and you start to take it off and it hurts, do you take the Band-Aid off slowly or do you rip it off fast and the process is off faster? That's all I'm saying. take the band off faster.
The hairs on your arm that make a Band-Aid hurt are the lives of millions of human beings, and that's why it's got to be thought through very carefully what's done.
Hang on. So you're saying that my policies would lead to a genocide of the Australian people? Is that what you're trying to say?
No, don't.
Well, no,
I didn't say a genocide. It's. I'm sure it's not. A genocide has a certain intent, John. I'm just talking about it. It can be very, very traumatic and devastating to human beings. And there's the post-war model of what Australia achieved post-war is, in my view, an absolutely better way.
Well, I mean, dare I say, I think my policy would have less harm than what Daniel Andrews did in the last 2 years.
Well, you didn't live here.
Okay, well, I'm going to call time on this this debate. Look, we could go on for another 4 or 5 hours. I think we should probably get you both back on another time, because there's a lot more we can explore, and the community actually really enjoyed the free flowing conversation and the fact that there were some interesting points of disagreement. But I hope you guys found that useful. Robbie, any final thoughts? And I'll get final thoughts from John before I close the show.
No. I think we've the debate is these are the big issues that we need to debate. But I'll just I'm not going to convince him, but I'll just reiterate. I'm known for what I say about China, that its collapse has been predicted for 20 plus years, and it hasn't collapsed because it does mean something when you have a productive economy. We used to have a productive economy, and we had a lot of strength from having a productive economy. And I mean, people probably we've gotten away from it so much. People can often lose contact with what it means and the difference that it makes when you can manufacture for yourself. You've got a lot more skilled workers skilled workers, people who can do things in your workforce, etc. We were a manufacturing powerhouse up until the 1980s, and we gave it all away. And now we're paying for that. And that's China's strength. And it's the reason I disagree with John. It's not going to collapse. It can pay its debts because of what they've been used to invest in and create that. And we need to get back to that kind of approach.
Thank you, Robbie. John, any final closing thoughts?
Well, I mean, the point that Robbie just made, that the Chinese can pay their own debts, a complete fantasy. If that was true, China would not have to intervene in their domestic economy every time they want trouble and be able to inject more stimulus. The injection of more stimulus by the Chinese time and time again is demonstration that they have an economy built on
investment, John.
No, look, it's a foundation built on sand, Robbie. I mean, we've done the same. China's done it slightly differently, but they cannot pay their debts. And that's why they keep on propping it up. I mean, Evergrande could have brought down the CCP a few months ago.
That was the biggest exaggeration ever. Don't believe Western propaganda about China.
Well, I mean, now, look, a final comment, Martin. At the beginning of this debate, you had asked the question of the audience, what was going to be the poll question. I'm not sure if you've put one up or not, but perhaps, Martin, I've outlined my philosophy of restoring a sustainable economy and restoring political and civil rights, and returning Australia to a country of civilized culture and growth and advancement. And Robbie's outlined his vision of significant state intervention and not resolving the problem in the most expedient way. So perhaps the poll question should be, which policy vision would the audience prefer, and who should be the Prime Minister? Okay, well, I'm just adding the... I'm just doing that now. So there you've got a choice. You can vote for Robbie, you can vote for John, and we'll just let that run for a little while longer, and we'll see whether we get any votes, eh?
Oh, dear.
Some people, of course, might have actually dialed off, but we actually have a. We'll let the poll run for just a few moments and see what happens. The beauty of it is in the YouTube thing now, you can put the poll up pretty quickly, so it's there and running. I'm sure John will be voting for himself.
Can I just warn the audience? If you vote for John, I'll never hear the end of it. Give me a sympathy vote, please.
Look, the point I want to make is that these big picture discussions, these are the things that should be being discussed in Canberra, right? These are the things that should be being discussed in Treasury, not the little policy matters, not the little, do I provide a little bit more incentive for home buyers or not? Surely these are the big strategic questions that should be being discussed, and yet I don't see any evidence at all of any of these sorts of things being explored in the decision-making forums that we have in this country, and I think that's a real problem.
There's no ideological distinction really between them.
Well, maybe that's the problem. Maybe everybody's on the neoliberal gravy train, as it were. So therefore, there's no reason.
But I think at the tops of the two major parties, that's true.
Yeah, that's pretty.
Now, Martin, I don't want to put you in a difficult spot, but did you want to declare to the audience how you're going to vote in the poll?
Oh my God!
No, I'm not going to. I will. I will.
Someone has to be.
I will sit on the sidelines. Just to be clear, my role here is facilitator and enabler. Right? I run the technology and I run the show, but doesn't necessarily mean that I have to actually take.
I'm going to vote for John because.
No. I
have to acknowledge something. I have to acknowledge something. This guy has been talking about we should debate for 3 years or something at least. Yes. And he figured out a way to wrangle himself into this show and turn it into a debate. So, John, kudos. You're a smart operator and you've got your way.
Yeah, well, what I will say is that of all the live shows that I've done, I've run a few hairy ones in my time. This is right up there in terms of trying to keep the balance order. But thanks for being respectful for each other, even if you disagree. So that's fine.
Well, the thing is, the one thing I will say, Martin, is that what the audience hasn't witnessed tonight is that when I really pushed Robbie's buttons and I know how to do it, he has an uncontrollable rage like previous totalitarian dictators of human history.
Okay, well, yes. Robbie, you'll have to come back on that one. You can't leave that hanging.
Oh, dude. That's my comp.
No, very good. Okay, so the answer is, I'm going to give you the results. 128 votes, right, in the time, so that's good. And 38% Robbie, 62% John. So, John, we're about to collapse the economy.
All right, I tried.
Well, I mean, the only thing I will say is that, perhaps Robbie should re-listen to this debate and perhaps, potentially adjust the policies of the Citizens Party that would garner more support from the Australian people.
Indeed. Well,
right back at you, John. Re-listen to the debate and consider what I said.
Well, I want to say, guys, thank you both very much for coming on and going no holds barred. And thanks, John, for using the audio. I think worked all right, so that's good. I'm going to take you both offline now, and I'm going to close the show. Vanessa said, episode of the year. Thanks for the great show. So that's very good, and a lot of positive comments. So well done both. And look, very important issues touched on tonight. So thank you both.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Okay, well, there you go. Whew, I'm hot. It's 10 p.m. That's a long show. So thank you very much for watching tonight. And just to let you know that next week, I want to take the conversation on a bit further. I'm going to be discussing with Adam CBDC versus crypto. Adam Stokes, of course, is a crypto supporter, but we're going to go take this conversation further, because the central bank digital currency and how that plays into digital identity and how that plays back into what we've been discussing tonight is a nice follow-on. So mark your diaries and come back next week for another discussion on the evolution of the financial services industry around the world and how central bank digital currencies may or may not have a role to play in the future. So thank you very much for watching. Have a good evening, and check out our live shows each Tuesday, and of course our other shows, and also on the interests of the people. And to remind you just once more that the interview with Senator Bragg is on the interests of the people, on the Interests of the People channel, and that was the show we put up yesterday, which was Senator Bragg talking about the ASIC inquiry. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you once again to Robbie and John, and I'm going to sign off now and just take a cold shower. I think I probably need it after that. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.